I used to tell myself it was just boredom, just the humdrum pace of life, the repetition of routines, the weight of silence that settled inside these walls. My husband left early, came back late, always tired, always distracted. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and somewhere along the way, the sound of my own breathing was the only company I had. The house wasn't always this quiet. When I first moved in, it felt like a fresh start. A family waiting to be built, warmth waiting to be shared. But life, it doesn't always unfold like the fairy tales they sell you. My husband had his world and I became a shadow in it. Then there was him, my husband's son. Older than most stepchildren, old enough to keep his distance, but young enough to still feel out of place. We barely spoke beyond polite nods, casual greetings in the hallway. He was always tense, withdrawn, like he carried some invisible weight on his shoulders. I assumed it was just the awkwardness of a blended family, until I began noticing things I shouldn't have. The way his eyes dropped when I entered a room. The way he shifted uncomfortably when conversation lingered too long. There was hesitation in him, an insecurity that clung to his posture, his silences, his fleeting glances. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was none of my concern. I was the outsider in his world, stepping into a home already built, already structured. But my mind started noticing what my heart tried to ignore. Maybe it was the way he avoided mirrors, or the way his words tripped whenever the conversation turned personal. There was a softness in his discomfort that pulled at me, something fragile. I should have looked away, closed the door, and kept the distance respectable. But in that silence, when my husband barely noticed me anymore, his awkward presence was comforting. At least someone acknowledged I existed. At least someone looked even if it was accidental. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. A passing glance. An innocent observation. I told myself that every single day. But some truths have a way of creeping into your chest, tightening around your ribs until you can't breathe. I saw it clearer than I wanted to. The way he avoided his own reflection, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap, the way his gaze lingered a second too long when I leaned in too close. I should have ignored it, but I didn't. And that's where it all began. The days grew heavier, stretched between brief hellos and lingering stares. I began to notice things that once seemed meaningless. How he waited until I left the kitchen before entering, how his footsteps hesitated by the living room doorway when I watched television alone. He existed around me like a ghost, hovering at the edges, silent yet present. My husband? He barely noticed. He was swallowed whole by deadlines, business trips, and late-night conference calls. I could have disappeared, and he'd only realize when he ran out of clean shirts. Loneliness has a strange way of twisting your perception. You start craving the smallest forms of attention, reading meaning into things you once overlooked. I found myself paying attention to the way my stepson carried himself, his hunched shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact, how he constantly tugged at the hem of his shirt. There was something unspoken there, something buried deep beneath layers of discomfort. One evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen at the same time, an awkward collision of two people who were never meant to be alone together. I asked him simple things, harmless things. How his day went, if he was eating enough, if he'd thought about college options. His answers were short, his voice low, but I saw it. His posture straightened ever so slightly, his lips twitched in a brief, almost forgotten smile. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. I started being more present, taking longer routes around the house to cross his path, cooking meals I knew he liked, asking him to join me in the living room when his father wasn't home. It felt harmless. After all, wasn't it my job to make this place feel like home? But the conversations got longer, the silences more comfortable. He began opening up, speaking about things I suspected no one ever asked him about. Insecurities about himself, pressures from school, the quiet dread of not measuring up to his father's expectations. I listened. I listened because no one listened to me either. And somehow, in our shared silence, a connection took root. Then came the touch. Small at first, a reassuring hand on his forearm when he spoke of disappointment, a brief squeeze on his shoulder after a long day. I told myself it was innocent, maternal even, but the warmth that followed stayed far longer than it should have. His glances became different. Longer. Thicker with something I didn't want to name. And I felt my breath catch, heart stumble, whenever our fingers brushed, whenever our bodies came too close in tight spaces. Lines were blurring, and I didn't stop them. It happened on a night that felt heavier than usual. The sky outside was bruised with storm clouds, the wind rattling the windows in short bursts. My husband was away again, another trip, another excuse, and the house felt unusually still. Quiet, but not peaceful. A quiet that pressed against my skin, made every sound feel louder, every breath feel slower. I was curled up on the couch, a half-forgotten book in my lap, the television murmuring in the background. He hovered by the doorway, hands shoved deep into his pockets, hesitating like a boy unsure of his place. I looked up, surprised to see him standing there. He shifted from one foot to the other, avoiding my gaze. "Do you mind if I sit here?" His voice cracked slightly, unsure, like he was afraid I'd send him away. I nodded, patting the empty spot beside me. He sat, leaving too much space between us at first. His body rigid, his hands clenched in his lap. The storm outside groaned, thunder rolling low across the sky. I closed the book, let it rest on the coffee table, and turned towards him. I asked simple things. Was he okay? Did he want to talk? He hesitated, but his shoulders softened. Words spilled out slowly. Insecurities he carried like chains, feelings of being invisible, of never being enough. He spoke of comparisons he couldn't escape, of expectations he couldn't meet. Something inside me cracked. I reached out before thinking, resting my hand gently on his knee. A simple gesture, meant to comfort. But the moment my skin touched his, I felt it. The tightening in the air, the sharp intake of his breath, the subtle tremor in his leg beneath my palm. Our eyes met, and neither of us looked away. I told myself to pull back, to stand up, to walk away from the edge I'd been flirting with for weeks. But my hand stayed. His breathing deepened. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes, searching for permission, for forgiveness, for something I wasn't supposed to give. He leaned forward first, slow, hesitant, unsure, and I didn't stop him. Our lips met, tentative, soft, testing boundaries that had already begun to erode. My fingers found their way to his neck, pulling him closer, melting into the moment with reckless abandon. Thoughts screamed at me, guilt clawed at my chest, but my body ignored them. I tasted warmth, desperation, and something forbidden on his lips. Hands moved where they shouldn't have, hearts pounded against cages meant to hold them back. By the time I realized how far we'd gone, it was too late. The line wasn't blurred anymore. It was shattered. The next morning felt colder, even though the sun had returned. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered. Inside me, inside this house, inside every cautious glance that was exchanged. I stood by the kitchen counter, hands trembling as I poured coffee into my favorite cup, the one my husband bought me on our anniversary. My reflection in the window stared back, hollow-eyed, heavy-hearted. I heard soft footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The air shifted when he entered the room, the silence between us thicker than it had ever been. No words were spoken. What could we say that wouldn't sound like betrayal echoing through the walls? When our eyes finally met, his were filled with something unfamiliar, confusion, guilt, but also something softer. Affection, perhaps. Or maybe hope. But hope in something that should have never existed. I quickly looked away, swallowed down the lump that formed in my throat. Every cell in my body screamed that it was wrong, that I had crossed a line that wasn't mine to cross. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, a night carved out of loneliness and neglect. But even as the excuses formed in my mind, they crumbled just as fast. The door opened minutes later. My husband's voice echoed through the hallway, cheerful, oblivious. He hugged me like nothing had changed, kissed my cheek like we were whole, like I was still the woman he thought he knew. I smiled back, robotic, hiding the storm that raged just beneath my skin. Throughout the day, I caught glimpses of my stepson. His usual nervous glances were now laced with something deeper, something unsettling. We avoided being alone in the same room. Words were scarce. Eye contact was rare. The weight of last night sat between us like an invisible barrier, pressing down on every breath. That night, lying next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling, suffocated by the walls around me. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal I carried in my bones, or the emptiness that had driven me there in the first place. I had crossed a boundary meant to protect us all, and now everything felt broken. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Only one truth played on repeat in my head. Some mistakes are too heavy to escape, some lines too dark to ever step back from. And I knew, deep down, life in this house would never be the same again.